In May of 1945, the German Reich ceased to exist. The ruins of Berlin marked the total collapse of a regime that had promised 1,000 years of power and barely survived 12. With the defeat, the Allied armies took absolute control, and the Nazi leaders faced trials, executions, or suicide. But they were not the only ones. The women who had lived at the very center of power were caught in the fall. Without protection, without privileges, and under the gaze of a world determined to destroy every trace of Nazism, their fate became uncertain and dark. They were not soldiers nor generals, but they were tied to the heart of the regime and paid an inevitable price. What happened to them when the flags of the Reich fell? How did they face the most absolute defeat? What did it mean to be the wife of a Nazi leader at the end of the war? The last mistress, Eva Braun, in the ruins of the Reich. Eva Hanna Paula Braun was born in the city of Munich in February of 1912. Her father, Friedrich Braun, worked as a teacher in a trade school, while her mother, Franziska Kronberger, devoted herself to household chores. The family belonged to the German Catholic middle class and instilled in their daughters an atmosphere of discipline and traditional values. Eva's childhood developed within this framework, under rigid rules that shaped her early years. Formal education began in a convent of Franciscan nuns and subsequently continued in a secondary school. There, she leaned more towards practical and aesthetic interests than towards academic life. Fashion, swimming, and gymnastics occupied her attention during her youth. At 17 years old, she decided to leave her studies and seek employment, a decision that would lead her to join an environment that would change the course of her life. In 1929, she joined Heinrich Hoffmann's photography studio, the official photographer of the National Socialist Party. That space served as a meeting point for figures from Hitler's political circle. Eva started as a laboratory assistant, developing images and attending to the public. In that environment, she met Adolf Hitler, then a rising leader who was already using Hoffmann's images as a propaganda tool. Introduced simply as Miss Eva, she caught Hitler's attention, who sought opportunities to talk with her and began sending her small gifts. The relationship developed slowly, in an atmosphere of absolute secrecy. Hitler cultivated a public image of a leader completely devoted to Germany and considered that an exposed private life could detract from that construction. Eva, still a teenager, thus entered into an intimate circle not made up of the crowds that followed him in rallies. From then on, her life unfolded under the shadow of that dual condition, a close presence and an absent figure in public. The tension of that situation manifested itself on several occasions. In 1932, she attempted to commit suicide with her father's gun. She survived and was attended to immediately. 3 years later, she tried again, this time by ingesting sleeping pills. She also recovered, but the episodes made Hitler keep her closer and ensure her material comforts. From the second half of the decade, Eva became a regular visitor to the Berghof, Hitler's private residence in Obersalzberg. There she lived between walks, social gatherings, taking care of animals, and a constant hobby of recording private life scenes of the Führer in photography and home cinema. During the war, Eva remained in a secondary role, almost always settled in the Berghof or in Munich. The contact with Hitler was limited to leisure spaces, far from the political sphere. The correspondence she maintained with her family and friends shows that she often felt relegated, although she enjoyed a privileged lifestyle. She had access to dresses, jewelry, travels, and exclusive residences, but lacked political prominence. Her place was still that of a companion in private, without influence on the regime's strategic decisions. In the final months of the war, she made an irrevocable decision to remain in Berlin alongside Hitler. When the capital was already surrounded by the Red Army, she moved to the Chancellery bunker at the end of April 1945. She expressed that she did not wish to survive the defeat and that her fate was tied to Hitler's. The bunker, located beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery, consisted of an underground complex with narrow rooms, connected corridors, and improvised offices. In that space lived secretaries, trusted military personnel, and service staff. Eva Braun spent her days with the children of Joseph and Magda Goebbels and maintained a routine marked by waiting and uncertainty. On April 29, when the military situation was already irreversible, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony held in the bunker itself. The witnesses were Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. After signing the certificate, they offered those present a modest reception with champagne and sweets. The next day, on April 30, both decided to end their lives. In the afternoon, they retired to Hitler's private office. Eva ingested cyanide while Hitler used his firearm. Following the previous instructions, the staff wrapped the bodies in blankets and moved them to the garden of the Chancellery. There they doused them with gasoline and set them on fire, with the purpose of preventing them from falling into Soviet hands. When the Red Army occupied the place, they found the charred remains and secretly moved them to facilities under Soviet control. According to later reports, the fragments were buried, exhumed on several occasions, and finally destroyed in 1970 by order of the KGB. The death of Eva Braun closed a relationship kept in the shadows for more than 15 years. She never had a political role, but her name was linked to Hitler by the decision to remain with him until the end. Her fate was intertwined with that of her younger sister, Gretel Braun, who had married in 1944 to the SS officer Hermann Fegelein. Fegelein was arrested in the last days of April of 1945, accused of desertion, and executed by direct order of Hitler. Gretel, pregnant, gave birth to a daughter a few days after the death of her sister. In the post-war period, Gretel faced interrogation by the Allies and lived under the weight of the surname. In 1954, she remarried in the Federal Republic of Germany. Her daughter, Eva Barbara, ended her life in 1971 after a suicide, motivated by the death of her partner in an accident. With this, another branch of the Braun family, marked by ties to the National Socialist regime and its prolonged consequences over time, was closed. The Dark Mother, Magda Goebbels, and the children without a future. Johanna Maria Magdalena Ritschl was born in Berlin in November of 1901. She was the daughter of Oskar Ritschl, an engineer of modest training, and Auguste Behrendt. After her parents' separation, her mother married a Jewish merchant named Richard Friedländer. This new home allowed her to grow up in a diverse social environment in which Magda moved naturally during childhood. She studied in private schools in Brussels and, at the end of the Great War, returned to Germany. She had become fluent in several languages and cultivated a refined presence, which allowed her to access spaces of the upper bourgeoisie. In 1921, she married Günther Quandt, a Prussian industrialist with a consolidated fortune in the textile and armaments industry. Quandt, 2 decades older than her, already held a prominent position in the German economy. The union was celebrated in Bad Godesberg and placed Magda in an environment of luxurious residences in Berlin and vacation villas in the north of the country. The following year, her son Harold was born. The marriage soon deteriorated. The age difference and the rigid character of the businessman precipitated the separation, which was formalized in 1929. Magda obtained an apartment in Berlin and a large sum, while Harold remained under his father's guardianship, although he continued to visit his mother. That same year, she met Joseph Goebbels at a rally of the National Socialist Party. Goebbels, head of propaganda in Berlin, had distinguished himself for his oratory and for building an effective propaganda apparatus. Through Heinrich Hoffmann, Magda was introduced to Hitler's closest circle and began to participate in the party's activities. The relationship with Goebbels progressed rapidly. In 1930, they began living together, and the following year got married with Adolf Hitler as the main witness. That bond made her the wife of the future Minister of Propaganda and gave her a central place in the political elite. The contact with Hitler became close. Magda had long conversations with him and considered him a paternal figure, while Goebbels was jealous of that special attention. During the years of the Third Reich, Magda Goebbels was presented as the embodiment of the Nazi female ideal. Mother of a large family, dedicated wife, and distinguished presence at official events, She appeared in family photographs that circulated as propaganda of the Aryan model. With Joseph, she had 6 children: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun. In each image, the children appeared meticulously dressed and projected as a symbol of German youth. Unlike Eva Braun, whose existence remained in the shadows, Magda was seen in public and played a visible role as a social reference. In April of 1945, when the Red Army advanced on Berlin, Joseph and Magda moved their children to the Führer bunker under the Reich Chancellery. The entrance occurred in the middle of the month. The children were installed in a room on the lower level with beds aligned. In the shelter, they lived with soldiers, secretaries, doctors, and service personnel, all aware that defeat was imminent. Magda kept the children tidy, organized games to distract them, and tried to maintain a domestic routine amid the confinement. On the 30th of April, after the suicide of Hitler and Eva Braun, the situation in the bunker changed. Joseph and Magda expressed their decision not to survive the collapse and to include their children in it. On the 1st of May, a dinner was organized in which the children, their parents, and part of the staff participated. There were no signs for the miners of what would happen next. That same night, according to the testimony of the SS dentist Helmut Kunz, the children were given morphine injections to sleep. Once unconscious, the doctor Ludwig Stumpfegger placed cyanide capsules in their mouths and crushed them. The 6 bodies were lined up in their beds. The following day, on the 2nd of May, Joseph and Magda left the interior of the shelter. They ingested cyanide capsules and died in the garden of the Chancellery. Goebbels' body was finished off with a gunshot. Both corpses were doused with gasoline and set on fire, although the flames did not completely destroy them. Soviet troops later found the remains, along with the bodies of other Nazi leaders. Before dying, Magda had written several letters. One of them was addressed to her son Harold, a prisoner of war at that time. In it, she affirmed her decision to die with her children and expressed absolute loyalty to Hitler. Other notes written in the bunker were collected by Soviet officers and taken to Moscow. In them, she argued that her children should not grow up in a world after National Socialism. Her decision caused shock even among those present in the bunker. Some suggested that the children could be evacuated or handed over to relatives. Magda refused, insisting that death was preferable to defeat. The bodies of the children were found by Soviet soldiers, and autopsies confirmed the ingestion of cyanide. Their remains, along with those of their parents, were secretly moved to Soviet facilities. Harold Quandt survived the war as an Allied prisoner. After his release, he inherited part of the Quandt family fortune and became a prominent businessman in post-war Germany. He never spoke publicly about the letters received or the death of his half-brothers, maintaining silence about the episode that marked his mother and Hitler's inner circle in the last days of the Reich. Broken privileges, Gerda Bormann between escape and death. The Buch family breathed National Socialism long before the movement reached power. Walter Buch had been one of the first members of the party and would become the chief judge of the NSDAP's honor court. His daughter Gerda grew up in 1909 in Konstanz, surrounded by symbols, speeches, and political meetings that would mark her early adherence to the Nazi ideology. During the 1920s, the young Gerda met Martin Bormann, a man 6 years older who was trying to make his way in the party ranks. Bormann had joined the NSDAP in 1927 and immediately became involved with the SA, the paramilitary organization that ensured control of the streets. It was at these meetings that he befriended Walter Buch and met Gerda. The relationship quickly intensified, and in 1929 they got married. Power radically transformed the lives of the Bormann couple. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Martin was appointed Chief of Staff to Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of the Reich. The real opportunity came in 1941, when Hess flew to Scotland and lost all political relevance. Bormann took his place as Hitler's personal secretary, becoming the man who controlled access to the Führer. From that position, he filtered decisions, distributed favors, and punished disobedience. Gerda, as the wife of the man closest to Hitler, became part of the Reich elite. The life of the Bormanns took place in confiscated mansions, with domestic service at their disposal and material resources obtained thanks to Martin's control over assets confiscated from Jews and opponents. Gerda shared this lifestyle naturally, managing the family homes and organizing social life. Between 1930 and 1943, she gave birth to 10 children: Adolf, Martin, Irmgard, Heinrich, Eva, Gerda, Fritz, Volker, Udo, Ello, and Rudolf. The upbringing was marked by indoctrination. Gerda conveyed the regime's ideology to her children, encouraging the cult of Hitler and absolute obedience. The family was frequently visited by high-ranking officials, and the children were seen as an example of the large National Socialist family. Later testimonies from some of them described the education they received as rigid and dominated by political references, in contrast to the life of material privileges they enjoyed. With the fall of the Reich in the spring of 1945, Gerda's position changed abruptly. While the Soviets encircled Berlin, Bormann organized the dispersion of his family. 5 of the children were entrusted to him, while Gerda escaped with the other 4, posing as a director of a children's home. Under false identities, they traveled on a school bus destined for South Tyrol in Italy. The intention was to reach a refuge area where a certain Nazi presence was still maintained, and from there reorganize their future. Martin Bormann, in parallel, attempted to flee Berlin with other leaders in the early morning of the 2nd of May, 1945. He was last seen in the vicinity of Lehrte station after attempting to cross the Soviet lines. For years, his fate was a mystery. In 1972, human remains were found in that sector of Berlin that were identified as his, confirming that he had died in 1972-45, probably by suicide with cyanide. Gerda settled in a small town near Bolzano. There she found temporary protection thanks to party contacts that secured a place to hide documents and belongings. However, she was already showing severe symptoms of an illness that had been developing for some time. Her sister-in-law, Elisabeth Bormann, left testimony that Gerda was suffering from intense abdominal pain that would not cease. Upon being examined by a local doctor, she was diagnosed with advanced-stage ovarian cancer. The progression of the disease coincided with her capture. British intelligence services identified her whereabouts and interrogated her in 1945. Fearing being transferred to a prisoner camp, Gerda showed panic, although she was eventually allowed to receive medical care. She was operated on in a military hospital in Murano without success. Aware of the imminence of her death, she requested religious assistance and formally converted to Catholicism, a decision that surprised even her family by how quickly she abandoned her previous convictions. Gerda died on the 23rd of March, 1946, at just 36 years old. His end was discreet and went unnoticed compared to the fate of other members of the Nazi elite. His remains were buried in Tyrol. The fate of the 10 children of the Bormann family was marked by the surname. Some were given to adoptive families after the war. Others grew up in charitable institutions. Adolf Martin, the eldest, became a Catholic priest in the 1960s and worked on reconciliation projects. Volker, another of the children, died young in tragic circumstances. Eva and Gerda moved to Bavaria and lived under new surnames. The surname Bormann was in the post-war period synonymous with repression, corruption, and clandestinity, which made the reintegration of his descendants difficult. The faithful nurse, Margarete Himmler, under the executioner's burden. A train journey between Munich and Berlin in 1922 marked the beginning of the connection between Margarete Boden and Heinrich Himmler. She was trained as a nurse, came from a wealthy family in Poznan with agricultural properties, and was older than the young student who was just beginning to approach the National Socialist Party. During the journey, they talked about discipline, service, and patriotism, values that united them from the start. Margarete had served in field hospitals during the First World War. There she encountered the military rigor and the nationalist atmosphere that permeated the Reich. After the conflict, she continued working as a nurse and became involved in charitable activities. Himmler, with his meticulous character and his idealization of German rural life, found in her a companion willing to share that vision. The marriage took place in July of 1928. As a gift, they received agricultural land in Waltrudering near Munich, where they planned to live as farmers. For Himmler, the peasant model was an example of racial purity and social order. Margarete supported this aspiration and got involved in the management of the farm. However, economic difficulties and Himmler's political rise soon diverted the couple's life towards other paths. In 1929, Himmler was appointed head of the SS. From then on, Margarete's position changed radically. She joined the social elite of the regime, participating in charity events, hospital visits, and ceremonies organized by women's associations of the party. As a volunteer of the German Red Cross, she reinforced the image of a disciplined and community-committed wife. That same year, her daughter Gudrun was born. From childhood, she was presented in official circles as an example of Aryan youth. Family photographs showed her alongside her father at public events, dressed in traditional Bavarian costumes or children's uniforms. She was known as the daughter of the Reichsführer SS and became a recognizable figure in the power environment. Margarete supervised her education rigorously and transmitted the National Socialist ideology in family life. The Himmler household combined privileges with strict discipline. Margarete organized domestic life, maintained relationships with other leaders' wives, and acted as a hostess at social gatherings. Her presence did not reach the public profile of women like Magda Goebbels, but she was known in the SS community for her involvement in charitable works. The stability was broken by Himmler's double life. Since 1936, he had maintained a relationship with his secretary Hedwig Hoss, with whom he had 2 children. Margarete learned of the situation in 1941. Although it caused tensions, it did not lead to separation. She agreed to continue as the official wife while her husband divided his time between both families. The war intensified this dynamic. Himmler established himself as one of the most powerful men of the regime, leading the SS, the Gestapo, and the concentration camp system. Margarete, in parallel, devoted herself to hospital visits, aid shipments to soldiers, and propaganda acts that demonstrated female solidarity with the front. Her role remained within the framework of the social apparatus, without access to political decisions. In the last few months of the conflict, Himmler attempted secret contacts with the British and Americans to negotiate a partial surrender, which amounted to a direct betrayal of Hitler. After the failure of these efforts, he tried to flee disguised as a private soldier under a false name. He was captured by the British in May of 1945, and during the search managed to ingest a hidden cyanide capsule, dying immediately. Margarete was then in the south of Germany with Gudrun. Both were detained by American troops in the Italian Tyrol. In Margarete's coat, a cyanide capsule was found sewn in, indicating that she was also prepared to commit suicide. Mother and daughter were first transferred to Verona, then to Rome, and finally to Germany. During the interrogations, Margarete insisted that she did not participate in politics and that she was unaware of the activities of the SS. She claimed that she had only been a mother and a nurse with no access to sensitive information. However, Allied intelligence reports indicated that she maintained frequent contact with other wives of leaders and was well acquainted with the privileges of the regime. Interned with her daughter in Augsburg until 1946, she faced denazification processes. Initially, she was classified as a major offender due to her position and benefits received, although after appeals, her status was reduced to a beneficiary of National Socialism. She lost her pension, her right to vote, and was sentenced to brief forced labor. In the post-war period, she lived in relative anonymity. She moved to Hiepen, near Bielefeld, where she resided with her sister Lydia. She avoided interviews and did not leave any memoirs. Official documents record repeated attempts to recover confiscated goods without results. She died in August of 1967 at the age of 74. She left no public testimony about the regime's crimes or about her husband's character, maintaining until the end a silence that reflected the distance between private life and the historical magnitude of the events. Blind loyalty, Ilse Hess chained to her husband's fate. The cultural circles of Munich in the decade following the defeat of 1918 brought together war veterans, students and nationalists in search of answers to the collapse of the German Empire. It was in that environment that Ilse Pröll met Rudolf Hess around 1920. She had come to the city to continue studies in philology and German literature. He, a decorated veteran, was returning from the front with visible wounds and the weight of war experience. The meeting took place in gatherings where literary, philosophical and political topics were debated. Both shared admiration for romantic poets like Hölderlin and for composers like Wagner, as well as a common interest in the fate of Germany after the Treaty of Versailles. Ilse came from a wealthy family in Hanover, with an academic maternal tradition and resources from her paternal textile industry. The intellectual affinity soon turned into personal and political commitment when both approached the National Socialist movement. The relationship was consolidated with Hess's entry into Hitler's inner circle, first as an assistant and later as a lieutenant. In 1927, Ilse and Rudolf got married in Munich. Since then, she has taken an active role in party tasks, from street propaganda to philanthropy organized by women's associations. Although she did not hold a political position, she was recognized as a faithful militant to the regime and as a constant support to her husband. Ilse participated in the training stage of the movement, distributing leaflets, putting up posters, and collaborating in the editing of the official newspaper. She also acted as Hess's secretary in the administrative tasks he performed for Hitler. Ilse's loyalty became even more visible after the failed beer hall coup in 1923, when Rudolf, along with other activists, was imprisoned. During that period, Ilse visited her fiancé regularly in prison, consolidating a bond that would remain unbreakable. In 1937, their only son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, was born. The family resided in Munich and frequently interacted with other Nazi leaders. While Rudolf dedicated long days to serving Hitler, Ilse took care of domestic life and upbringing, always under the party's ideology. On the 10th of May of 1941, Rudolf Hess undertook a solo flight to Scotland, piloting a Messerschmitt fighter with the aim of negotiating a separate peace with the United Kingdom. After landing in the vicinity of Glasgow, he was captured by local farmers and handed over to the British authorities. The action baffled the regime and provoked Hitler's wrath, who stripped him of all his posts and branded him a traitor. In Germany, Ilse faced that new reality. From being the wife of a hierarch, she became seen as the woman of a man dishonored by the Nazi leadership. Even so, she maintained her loyalty to Rudolf. She continued writing to him under strict British censorship and upheld his image in private circles, defending that he had acted out of patriotism. With the fall of the Third Reich in 1945, Ilse was detained by American troops in Bavaria. She went through internment centers in Augsburg and Nuremberg, where she was interrogated about her militancy and her husband's activities. She claimed that her role had been domestic and social, without involvement in political decisions. Allied reports classified her as a secondary follower, although always loyal to National Socialism. During the Nuremberg trials, Rudolf Hess appeared as the principal defendant for conspiracy and crimes against peace. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to Spandau prison in Berlin. Ilse, after undergoing a denazification process in 1948, was classified as a Mitläuferin, that is, a passive follower. That category implied the loss of political rights and assets linked to the party, but did not entail a prolonged sentence. She regained her freedom that same year and moved with her son to Bavaria, where they led a discreet life. From then on, Ilse focused her efforts on the public defense of her husband. In 1952, she published the book Rudolf Hess, Ich kenne ihn, in which she presented him as an honest and visionary man. 2 years later, she edited Rudolf Hess, Brief aus Nürnberg, a compilation of letters written by Rudolf during the trials. Over time, she published more volumes of correspondence and testimonies, building a narrative intended to portray him as a political prisoner. The detention regime in Spandau allowed controlled visits. Ilse regularly went with her son, having monitored conversations with Rudolf. After 1966, when Hess remained the only prisoner in Spandau, those visits gained even more significance. Ilse became the main link between the inmate and the outside world and his most constant defender. On the 17th of August 1987, Rudolf Hess died in prison at 93 years old. The official version indicated that he had committed suicide by hanging himself with a cable, although his son and related circles held alternative theories about a possible conspiracy. Ilse rejected the official explanation and maintained the idea that her husband had been the victim of a covert murder. In the following years, Ilse continued as a reference in neo-Nazi and revisionist groups in Germany and Austria. She collaborated with far-right publications, attended private events, and maintained correspondence with supporters who considered her a symbol of unwavering loyalty. She died in Bavaria in 1995, at 95 years of age, never renouncing the defense of Rudolf Hess's memory. The Widow of Terror, Lina Heydrich, and the Legacy of the Holocaust. On the 6th of December of 1930, at a dance held in Kiel, Lina von Osten met Reinhard Heydrich. At 19, she had already joined the National Socialist Party and participated in female youth organizations of the movement. She came from the small rural Prussian nobility on the island of Fehmarn, the daughter of a professor and a mother dedicated to home management. Her childhood was spent in an environment of discipline and conservative nationalism. Heydrich, 27 years old, had been expelled from the Navy due to a love scandal. He was tall, athletic, and blonde-haired, with features considered Aryan, although his figure impressed more by hardness than by harmony. Lina was impressed by his determination and ambition. A few weeks after the meeting, they got engaged, and on the 26th of December 1931, they got married. It was Lina who prompted him to approach the Nazi Party. In a period when Heydrich was unemployed, she encouraged him to interview with Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. Thanks to that management, he obtained a position in the newly created intelligence service, the Sicherheitsdienst. That entry in 1931 proved decisive for the start of a brilliant career. The couple settled in Berlin and soon enjoyed material privileges. Lina proudly assumed her role as the wife of an up-and-coming leader. They had 4 children: Klaus, Heider, Silke, and Marte. She took care of domestic life and maintained ties with other wives of Nazi leaders. They resided in properties granted by the regime and were part of a privileged environment reserved for the power elite. The appointment of Heydrich as head of the Gestapo in 1934 and later as head of the Reich Main Security Office consolidated the family's position. Lina participated in receptions and official events, projecting herself as a loyal and ambitious woman. Although without a direct political role, she was recognized as a figure close to power, supporting her husband's career. In September of 1941, Heydrich was appointed Deputy Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. The family moved to the castle of Panenské Břežany, a residence confiscated from Jewish owners on the outskirts of Prague. From there, Lina managed family life and participated in social events while Heydrich imposed a regime of repression that made him one of the most feared men of the Reich. On the 27th of May of 1942, he suffered an attack organized by Czech parachutists trained in Great Britain. A grenade thrown against his car seriously injured him. After several days of agony, he died on the 4th of June in a hospital in Prague. His funeral in Berlin was a state event attended by Hitler and the Nazi leadership. Lina, at 31 years old, was left a widow of one of the most powerful leaders of the regime. Hitler ordered that extraordinary benefits be granted to her. She received a lifetime pension and properties in Fehmarn, in addition to official recognition as a hero's widow. Her status ensured her a comfortable life during the final years of the war. With the German defeat, she was arrested by the Allied forces. In 1946, she appeared before a denazification court. The charges focused on her membership in the party, the appropriation of confiscated goods, and her closeness to one of the main perpetrators of the Holocaust. As no evidence of direct participation in crimes was found, she was acquitted and classified as a Mitläuferin, category of passive follower. She recovered part of her assets and retained the state pension. She settled again in Fehmarn, where she managed a tourist pension and a farm. During the 1950s and 60s, she undertook legal battles against the German state to secure and expand her rights. In 1956 and 1959, she obtained favorable rulings that allowed her to receive full pensions as a civil servant's widow. Lina never distanced herself from the figure of her husband. In interviews, she defended him as a disciplined man loyal to Germany. In 1976, she published her memoirs under the title Leben mit einem Kriegsverbrecher, where she recounted her married life and justified Heydrich's career, presenting him as a servant of the state rather than as an executor of genocide. In the following years, she gave interviews in which she reiterated that her husband had been a victim of unjust demonization. He died in Fehmarn on the 14th of August 1985 at the age of 74. Until the end of his life, he defended Heydrich's memory and retained the benefits granted by the state, becoming an example of how the network of supports and privileges of the regime survived in certain aspects beyond the military defeat. From luxury to emptiness, Emmy Goring after the fall of the Reich. A stage was the natural element of Emma Johanna Henny Sonnemann. From her youth in Hamburg, where she had come into the world on the 24th of March of 1893, Emmy had defied her father's will to pursue an artistic career. Carl Sonnemann, owner of a chocolate factory, opposed his daughter dedicating herself to the theatre, but Emmy succeeded, and during the Weimar Republic, she consolidated her career as an actress. His interpretive style was marked by classical training and soon gained some notoriety in German-speaking theatre. Although he did not become a star of sound cinema, his presence on prestigious stages assured him a place in the cultural life of the time. In 1932, during a social event in Berlin, he met Hermann Goering. Goering was a hero of the First World War and one of the main leaders of the Nazi Party. Widowed since 1931 after the death of his first wife Karin, he became interested in the actress, with whom he began a relationship that quickly took on an official character. The couple married in 1935, in a ceremony attended by Adolf Hitler, who acted as the main witness. With the link, Emmy came to occupy a symbolic role in the hierarchy of the Third Reich. Since Hitler remained single and avoided showing a partner, it was she who in many events played the role of First Lady of the Reich. She accompanied Goering in official ceremonies, parades and diplomatic receptions, appearing in photographs and newsreels as an example of the distinguished and elegant German woman. Her presence on the political stage was used as a propaganda tool to provide the regime with a female face. The private life of the Goerings unfolded in an atmosphere of excessive luxury. Residing in the Karin-Hall mansion, built in memory of Goering's first wife, the family enjoyed confiscated artworks, valuable furniture, and collections from lootings in occupied territories. Emmy participated in the organization of receptions and banquets attended by Nazi leaders, foreign diplomats, and cultural personalities related to the regime. In 1938, her only daughter, Edda Goering, was born. The girl was raised in an environment of privilege, surrounded by domestic staff and luxury items. Emmy devoted herself to her education in the early years while continuing to appear at official events. Her artistic career was relegated to the background, although she maintained contact with Berlin theatre circles. With the outbreak of the war in 1939, the family's position remained at the pinnacle of power. Goering led the Luftwaffe and retained influence in the government, while Emmy remained a visible figure in public ceremonies. Life in Karin-Hall continued to be marked by parties, hunts and receptions, even as the war progressed with increasingly adverse results for Germany. The defeat of the Reich in 1945 put an end to that world. In April of that year, with the Soviet advance on Berlin, Goering ordered the demolition of Hall to prevent it from falling intact into enemy hands. Emmy fled with her daughter to the south of Germany, seeking refuge in Bavaria. On the 7th of May of 1945, she was arrested by United States troops in Fischhorn, Austria, and separated from Edda, who was placed under military custody. During the Allied interrogations, Emmy was questioned about her involvement in the regime and about the origin of the art collections accumulated in Hall. She insisted that she had never had a political role and that she had merely accompanied her husband in social events. The investigators, however, considered her a direct beneficiary of the cultural plunder and the looting of Jewish properties. In the subsequent denazification processes, Emmy Goring was classified as a minor offender and sentenced to 1 year in prison. Moreover, approximately 30% of her assets were confiscated, and she was banned from practicing her profession as an actress for 5 years. She served her sentence in internment camps between 1945 and 1946, and subsequently in a German prison until she was released. The post-war period represented a radical decline in her standard of living. With the regime destroyed and the assets seized, Emmy moved to a small apartment in Munich where she lived modestly with her daughter. She attempted to resume her artistic career, but the initial ban and public discredit prevented her from doing so. In the 1950s, she tried to publish her memoirs, but the attempts failed due to a lack of editorial interest and social rejection of figures associated with Nazism. Despite these limitations, Emmy managed to support herself with sporadic jobs and the support of former personal contacts. She never regained the notoriety she had enjoyed in the 1930s. During the decades of the 1960s and 70s, she remained largely out of the public eye. She died on the 8th of June, 1973 in Munich at 80 years old. His burial was conducted in family privacy, without honors or public attention. His daughter Edda continued living in Bavaria, occasionally vindicating her father's memory, but maintaining a discreet profile that contrasted with the visibility that had characterized Emmy's life during the years of the regime. Between barbed wires, Hedwig Hoss in the shadow of Auschwitz. The family villa stood a few meters from the barbed wire fences. From its windows one could see the barracks, the watchtowers and the chimneys that constantly smoked. Hedwig Hensel had arrived at this place in 1940 with her husband Rudolf Hoss, when he was appointed commander of the Auschwitz concentration camp. For Hedwig, born in Baden-Baden in 1908, in a middle-class family with no notable ties to politics, that place represented stability and prosperity in times of war. Her youth had passed in a conventional domestic environment, focused on the education typical of women of her time. In the early 1920s, she had met Rudolf Hoss, a veteran of the First World War and a rising member within the National Socialist movement. The bond between the two quickly became stronger, and in 1929 they got married. After the wedding, Hedwig integrated into the life of a family marked by discipline and the ideology of National Socialism. Rudolf was rising in the SS hierarchy, which meant frequent relocations and new responsibilities. Over time, they had 5 children: Klaus, Heidetraut, Inge Brigitte, Annegret, and Hans Rudolf. The housing in Auschwitz included domestic service, abundant provisions, and a standard of living far superior to that enjoyed by most Germans during the war. Hedwig managed the house with the help of female prisoners who worked as servants, cleaning rooms and taking care of the garden, always under the watch of the SS. The proximity between family life and the extermination camp was noted in multiple later testimonies. Survivors declared having seen Hedwig riding a horse in the vicinity, sometimes accompanied by her children. She was also mentioned as the recipient of valuables and clothing from the goods confiscated from the prisoners. The degree of knowledge that Hedwig had about the functioning of the camp has been a subject of debate. In her later statements, she claimed that she never knew precisely what was happening in Auschwitz, that her husband hid the details from her, and that she simply took care of the house and the children. However, the testimonies of survivors and the physical proximity to the facilities raise questions about that version. The smells from the crematoria, The constant transit of trains loaded with deportees and the visibility of the barbed wires were part of the daily landscape. Several deported women recalled having worked in the villa, describing the elegantly furnished rooms and the contrast with the conditions of the camp. Some mentioned having seen Hedwig receiving gifts and objects that clearly did not come from normal commercial channels. In January of 1945, with the approach of the Red Army, the Hoss family left Auschwitz and moved first to Ravensbrück and then to other parts of Germany. Rudolf tried to hide under a false identity, while Hedwig was left in charge of the children in a country in ruins. In April, she was detained by British troops along with part of her family. During the initial interrogations, Hedwig insisted that she had not had any involvement in political activities nor knowledge of the crimes committed in Auschwitz. Her account portrayed a housewife unaware of the camp's matters, dedicated solely to the care of her family. To direct questions about the gas chambers or the mass executions, she responded with evasions or categorical denials. The researchers, however, were skeptical of that version, considering it impossible that she had lived in that environment without noticing what was happening. Despite those suspicions, she was never formally charged with war crimes. While Rudolf Hoss was tried in Poland and sentenced to death in 1947, she was released after a period of detention. The decision was based on the lack of documentary or testimonial evidence proving active participation in the activities of the camp. After her release, Hedwig rebuilt her life in silence. She settled in West Germany with some of her children, trying to stay out of the public eye. Between barbed wires, Hedwig Hoss in the shadow of Auschwitz. The family villa stood a few meters from the barbed wire fences. From its windows one could see the barracks, the watchtowers and the chimneys that constantly smoked. Hedwig Hensel had arrived at this place in 1940 with her husband Rudolf Hoss, when he was appointed commander of the Auschwitz concentration camp. For Hedwig, born in Baden-Baden in 1908, in a middle-class family with no notable ties to politics, that place represented stability and prosperity in times of war. Her youth had passed in a conventional domestic environment, focused on the education typical of women of her time. In the early 1920s, she had met Rudolf Hoss, a veteran of the First World War and a rising member within the National Socialist movement. The bond between the two quickly became stronger, and in 1929 they got married. Female shadows, wives and lovers at the end of Nazism. The women linked to the National Socialist Circle were not limited to the most visible figures. Beyond Eva Braun, Magda Goebbels or Lina Heydrich, there were other wives and lovers whose proximity to power marked destinies crossed by privileges, ruptures and silences. Their trajectories offer a complementary mosaic that shows how the fall of the Third Reich impacted intimate and family spheres. Gretel Braun grew up in the shadow of her sister Eva. In 1944, she gained her own prominence by marrying Hermann Fegelein, an officer of the Waffen-SS and close collaborator of Heinrich Himmler. The wedding, celebrated with pomp and in the presence of Hitler, consolidated her social position. However, less than 1 year later, defeat also dragged down her personal destiny. In April of 1945, when Berlin was besieged, Fegelein was accused of desertion and appropriation of looted goods. Hitler ordered his execution. Gretel, pregnant, became a widow at barely 29 years of age. After giving birth, she named her daughter Eva Barbara in memory of her sister. In the post-war period, she lived discreetly and with limited resources until in 1954 she married textile businessman Kurt Berlinghoff. Tragedy struck again in 1971 when her daughter committed suicide following her partner's death in a traffic accident. Meanwhile, Hedwig Potthast played a different role. She had joined as Heinrich Himmler's personal secretary in 1936, at just 24 years old. From 1939, she became his privately recognized mistress. With him, she had 2 children born in 1942 and 1944, who were accepted by Himmler in private, although never integrated into official life. Potthast lived in residences assigned by the SS, while Margarete Himmler remained in the main residence with the legitimate daughter Gudrun. After the German defeat, she was arrested and subjected to questioning in 1946. She denied knowledge of crimes and stated that her relationship with Himmler was exclusively personal. She was never prosecuted. After her release, she remarried and lived discreetly in the Federal Republic of Germany until her death in 1994. Henriette Hoffmann was another figure marked by her family environment. Daughter of Hitler's official photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, she grew up in proximity to the Führer and the Nazi leadership. In 1932, she married Baldur von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth and later governor of Vienna. During the 1930s, she was considered a model of the Nazi female ideal, young, elegant, and part of the elite. She had close contact with Hitler, whom she called with familiarity. In 1943, during a dinner in Munich, she dared to openly criticize the deportation of Viennese Jews. That gesture caused a definitive break with Hitler. Although she did not suffer formal sanctions, she lost influence in the Nazi environment. After the war, she was arrested, imprisoned for 4 years, and classified in the denazification as an accomplice of the regime. She divorced Schirach after his conviction in Nuremberg. In the post-war period, she published memoirs in which she recounted her relationship with Hitler with an ambivalent tone between nostalgia and criticism. She died in Munich in 1992. Käthe Dönitz embodied discretion among the wives of leaders. Married to Karl Dönitz, commander of the Kriegsmarine, she always avoided public life. When Hitler appointed him as successor in April of 1945, Käthe became the wife of the last head of state of the Reich. During those days, she remained with her husband in northern Germany. After the capitulation, Karl Dönitz was sentenced to 10 years in prison in Nuremberg. Käthe, with no charges against her, lived reclusively in Hamburg until her death in 1962. Her life was characterized by the absence of public statements and a complete withdrawal, even after the release of her husband in 1956. Annie Brandt, wife of Rudolf Brandt, personal secretary to Himmler, experienced one of the most abrupt downfalls. Her husband was accused in the doctor's trial of having participated in the organization of medical experiments in concentration camps. In 1948, he was sentenced to death and executed. Annie, who had enjoyed material stability during the war, was stigmatized by the surname and the memory of her husband's crimes. She was not prosecuted nor left public testimony. After the execution, she sought refuge in anonymity with no known descendants, and likely died in the 1970s in poorly documented circumstances. These women, situated between privilege and marginalization, complete the female universe of the Nazi regime. Some defended their husbands and maintained ties with revisionist circles in the post-war period. Others disappeared from the public scene, hiding their past in a persistent silence. All, without exception, were marked by their proximity to power and by the irreversible consequences of having been part of the intimate environment of National Socialism.